We're really excited to be hearing from our friend, the Reverend Dr. Floyd Thompkins, in a conversation that I got to have with him about all that's happening in this season, whether it's COVID-19 or the protests and the riots for Black Lives Matter. It's going to be a really compelling conversation, and so I'm just so glad that you've tuned in to join us.
And the first thing I just wanted to know is, how in the world are you doing in COVID-19? And with everything else that's happening in our country right now, how are you personally doing?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, because I think last week is, how are you doing in COVID-19? First of all, it's a question that is driven very differently for people of color than non-people of color, just because of the patterns of death. About 55% of all the people who've died up until last week were African Americans. And now there's 70% of all deaths are happening with people of color. So my experience and your experience are by definition going to be different. Yeah. Because I could say that I probably am connected to and know at least 100 people who have died. And most African Americans have known people who have died. That is not to say what most white Americans feel. We're also having, and that, so we're suffering something called stigmatized death, right? Which is the reality of dying, and we're being told that happens because of, because we live so badly. And in point of fact, it's not true. Around the world, race, when you take race out, there are two factors that are death factors, and that is whether you have healthcare and also whether you're poor, right? And so in this country, it's African Americans, which has led to the second reality, which is what has always been happening. Felt, meaning I and others have felt, that we have been under attack, and you look at somebody like me and you say he's male middle class, but I carry two IDs. I intentionally get the California ID because I know that when I'm walking I need an ID, and when I'm in the car an ID, because I'm going to get caught at a higher rate than you are, and I will be suspicious and will not agree. So I have to have my government issued IV, which is something that you may or may not have. And also as a person who's been stopped many times by police. So then, and also almost every African American know people like that. So it's not just whether I've been also, it is also that I work with kids who I'm worried about. And so that there, and I think what happened this past week was another stigmatized death, which is the reality of looking at a murder. It wasn't a death, it was a murder. And so with all of that there, you asked me, I know this is a question you probably didn't want this answer, but with all of that happening, you're in deep grief, and you're going through all the stages of death and mourning. And so you're going through it personally, you're going through it corporately, and also you're going through it in the sense of then how people are treating you, whether they're treating you meanly or empathetically, or whether they're telling you to get out. So that's also what's happening also, is you're reassessing, at least I am reassessing also. I find myself reassessing my friendships on the basis of how folks are dealing with me in this time, right? And that is not to, and then there may be somebody who's listening, he's like, he's being overly sensitive. And if you're asking that question, you're probably white. Right? Because you don't have the same experience that I statistically and realistically have. So the question is, so the answer is, yeah, I'm probably in grief, a little bit in anger, a little bit in just, and also theologically, I'm also in a place where, the where is God question, right? I mean, I can tell you that my experience of God is stronger and deeper. But the questions about God's actions, which often happens, are still ones that are even more profoundly confusing. And then you continue on remembering and appreciating people like yourself and other people who are loving and caring, and you want to make sure that you want to keep loving and caring them, and not because they might be experiencing a different you, and not making that seem as if somehow you're any less caring and loving. So long answer for a complicated time.
Yeah, it is, as you said, a complicated time. And first, thank you for being transparent and giving a glimpse for me as a white person, and for all the white folks that are watching, into perspectives that we honestly probably don't feel. I mean, I felt a little bit of exhaustion this week for the first time, and every time I felt that, I've tried to remember, at least personally and at an empathic level, that what you just said, this is what people of color are feeling most of the time. And so I'm exhausted because I went to one protest and saw some violence, and yet this is what people are going through day in and day out. And I think it's just really important for us to remember that as white folks. So thank you for helping us.
But also, I think there's also, as a Christian, and I'm a confessing Christian, also, I think there is the burden and the blessing of praying for those who also are doing these things. Right? The burden is that you don't really want to, honestly. The blessing is that you get to, so that your soul can expand and you can glimpse and still be hopeful about humanity. And one of the things that I've seen this round is a lot. I'm in a relationship with a lot of people who have a lot of different political views, different than mine, and also theological views different than mine. And I've watched them now begin to engage with one another on a human level. You and I are different, right? You're very doctrinal and theological. God bless you, bro. I actually think that doctrine devoid of the human experience and the expression of the Spirit is dangerous. I'm kind of where the Thurman's camp is. I'm a little bit more of a mystic. And I've always thought that those churches haven't had the affirmation of human experience, nor are they open to the reality of the visitation of the Spirit that always is surprising for what I thought. But somehow this time I'm watching on my Facebook and talk to people beginning to reassess, beginning to open their hearts to the experiences of others, and allowing that to say the imago Dei is in you, that this is happening to a child of God, and that my involvement or non-involvement is something that I now have to do business with as a person of faith. So that's the blessing of it. And that's the blessing of it as an African American. That has nothing to do with my skin color. It has something to do with my profession of faith and the person on the cross who opens his arms wide and say, we must love everyone, and even when love hard.
Yeah, totally. That's a good word. And you kind of already touched on this, but I just wonder if you can help us have a little context, because you have lived through countless moments like this in our country's history, of these kind of uprisings when there's been these terrible actions done by white police officers or white politicians. And there have been these moments where it seems like something might be able to change. And so, one, I just want to know, does this moment, what's been happening over the past week, feel any different than any of the other moments that you've experienced? And are you hopeful that we're going to make some ounce of progress in this moment and with what's happening?
Yeah, there's no future in a lack of hope, so one must be hopeful. So let's first begin there. So I actually think the question, what's really interesting, first of all, that was a very nice way of saying you're an old guy, so you've been through this before. So I get that. Okay, so I appreciate you being very kind about being an old guy. Now, secondarily, I actually don't believe. I don't believe that we haven't seen change, and that every moment in history, what we haven't seen is the change we'd hoped for, but we've seen change. And so, again, I think we're probably going to have the same thing. We want a bigger change that we're going to get, but I do believe there is some change. And so now about this moment in history. What's different about this moment in history is, I think there's a certain, and it's going to sound solicitous because I know your audience, but I say it all the time. I think that there is what's different about this moment in history is you and people like yourself and people of that generation who have grown up differently, have different connections, and who I I am grateful to say are having courage, because I think my generation, we thought it was enlightenment. Somehow the more you know, the better you're going to do. We now know that you can know everything you want to know, but until you have the courage to face and have a conversation, not just with someone who's different from you, but someone who's the same, looks like you, and the same experience, and therefore you can talk to them in a relationship of trust and say, this is what I've learned. This is where I've grown theologically. This is what I understand sociologically. This is what I understand spiritually. And I'm going to challenge you to believe that that's not all right to be that. That is what's different. And so a lot of times, as much as I talk, I realize that I have to shut up and say, I don't know. I mean, talk to somebody who has your experience and know. And that's in general the work that we do, is to remind people that really it's great to know history. And of course, I'm pretty controversial on this, is that I think it's important to know someone's history and understand history, but it's really more important to know someone's lived experience and understand how they have psychologically, sociologically, and spiritually metabolized that history into their lives. Yeah. Because that's what we're dealing with each other. We're not dealing with some effete sense of facts back there, right? We're dealing with how people have used that and understand that. And when we have that conversation, then I get a chance to challenge your hermeneutic. I get a chance to talk to you and go, really? I want you to think about what you just said. Yeah. And presume that in your humanity that you're just not trying to be mean and evil, but there may be, in fact, the way you metabolize it may be different. So that's, I think, what's different in this moment in history. Now, policy-wise, I also think that there is and it's important to do policy-wise. There is we're about to see some things going on politically where people are going to have to make some decisions. What you're watching is three things in these crowds. You're watching people who are protesting, you're watching people who are rioting, and you're watching people who are looting. And there are three different sets of people, right? The protesters are people who legitimately are angry and who are trying to raise the issue, like in the last, that we all know that America does not move unless the issue becomes really important to them. The rioters are people who actually are in anger, who feel the frustration, and out of the moment do things that are that impinge upon other people's right and ought to be stopped. The looters are opportunistic people, right, who don't care about the message at all. And so I wish we had a police force who was sophisticated enough to discern this. They're not. They're just treating it all as one. But if you do not affirm the protesters, if you do not, their right to protest. I mean, right now, the present administration has got it all wrong. They think that controlling is not the issue. Actually, what the issue is affirming people's right, as we have throughout American history, to protest, right? Because if you protest, right, then there's less going on. There's less reason to riot. And it doesn't happen because there is some moving forward, right? And if there's no riots, then the looters. That is a plan. What we're doing right now, control is not a plan. Control is a small human being with no ability to think imaginative, and who literally has the understanding that humanity is something that they rule, not something that they live with. And that's the problem with control. So there's some specifics that can be done this time. And so hopefully it will be. I'm mindful of our time. I could go on. I'm not.
No, it's good. I think what you bring up these three things that are happening, and obviously there's been a lot of conversation, primarily from white folks on social media, saying that these protests and the looting and the rioting, that they are actually hurting the cause that people are trying to advocate for. Obviously, that's not true when we take a historical lens and see how this has worked throughout history. But I wonder what you might say to the person who maybe is a Christian and is critiquing the protests or even the rioting side of things and saying, this is not what Jesus told us to do, turn the other cheek. I've gotten a lot of that over the past couple of days. How do you think about that Christianly, and also personally about not just the protests, but the riots and the needs for a riot.
There are different messages to different people. Again, I think those who sloppily look at this thing. I mean, I posted something on social media this morning. I forgot what it says because, you know, why would you remember your own stuff? But basically, the leadership that sees justice as oppositional unity, when that happens, then democracy is in peril. And one of the responses I got is someone talking about authoritarian, that what we have to do is make sure as citizens that we, bow to authority, and it was the scripture. And I kind of rolled back and go, I don't know what you're talking about. That's not what I said, okay? Because what I said was about, and that's what I mean by the inability to lock all this in one, right? The question is talking to leadership and saying they have to conceive of this issue differently, because if they don't, this is antithetical to democracy itself. So I think that so first of all, I wanted to just challenge and push back on the idea that it's one message to everybody. It's not. For the protesters, the message is, bless the Lord, oh my soul, go for it. I mean, that if you feel called to do it, you do it peacefully, and you do it with a strategy, right? There's no, I mean, suffragists did it. They did it with a strategy. Obviously, civil rights, they did it with a strategy. And LGBTQ, they did it with a strategy. But they also had, let's remember, there was a strategy of that. But then there were the rioters also. Civil rights, there was the Malcolm X and LGBTQ. Let us remember how this started in New York City with basically black and brown drag queens rising up, right? So at some point so the notion is a flashpoint of anger, not to say you're guilty for being angry, It may be unwise, or as the typical thing that Black preachers have said, I don't condone it, but I do understand it. And the reason it's important to begin that is because one of the things we don't want to do is to say to people, don't be angry, right? We just said there's a better use of anger, right? Yeah. In fact, the scripture that I would use is like, be angry, but sin not. And sin not doesn't mean that you don't express yourself. The sin not is that if anger only brings more oppression from the people who are the victims of oppression, that's a sin, right? Mm. And so the question is, what are you doing? What is this anger doing? And so when you get past that moment of anger, come back to protest. Right? Yeah. So as a Christian. The third folks who are alluding, they don't care about Christianity. They don't care about the cause. They don't care about anything. They're just being small people who are mean-spirited and who are hijacking. And of course, there's all this theory about who they are. Some of them might be white nationalists. Some of them might just be people who can't control themselves, whatever. But at this point, this is a problem. The problem is that there's nothing. How can you say you're a Christian and do that? Well, I'll tell you how you can say you're a Christian. All have sinned and come short of the glory of God, but you just don't keep embracing it, right? And so the question is to stop you, to arrest you, and to also give you a second chance too. Also. Yeah, it's important. So there are different responses there.
Yeah, I think for me though, like the rioting portion of things, because the protest I was able to participate in on Saturday down in Chula Vista here in San Diego, first of all, majority of it was a peaceful protest, and it did end up evolving into what there is precedent in these historical moments, as you pointed out, that when people have been held down for hundreds of years and have tried to do everything in their power to undo the oppression, and it's not happening, then it seems like there's a place for rioting. And I even looked at the image of Jesus. I posted this on social media this weekend of Jesus. Obviously, we talked about him overturning the tables. There's an aspect to that of saying,
like I said, you don't want to look at the. You don't want to say that anger is not legitimate, or not necessary.
Yeah.
Remember, this country was born when there was a whole bunch of folk who started the Boston Tea Party riot. Not only is this precedent, this is our historical, reality, and that is why it is so dangerous to do what police do. This is why, I posted the Trevor Noah piece, right? Because it's a contract, and after you have seen so many times it being violated, anger. That's why I started off very confessionally in our conversation saying, I'm going through anger, right? And so one of the things that is not a good thing to do is look at somebody and say you're angry, and that you shouldn't have been angry, or that somehow, because we know if you've ever been angry, and maybe there's somebody that hasn't been angry, I don't know who they are, but maybe there's somebody, I've done some stuff out of anger that I was pretty like, okay, I shouldn't have done that. But then I thought, on the other hand, it worked. Right? I'm not saying that's the way it is, but I'm just saying anger is one of those things that is not something we want to veer into. And if the country doesn't want to see that, it needs to stop that. And I think that's one of the reality of a riot or that kind of anger. It reminds people of why it is so important to have that social contract. It reminds people of the danger of what happens when you don't leave hope in somebody's hands. They will find something else to do. So I think that's the effectiveness of the riot is not, and that's what Martin Luther King's quote was. It wasn't to say that riots were good things. It was to say they don't come from nothing. There's an atmosphere that's created. And what we have to do is worry about not doing that, creating that atmosphere, right?
Yeah.
And so, so we're going to see a lot more of that. And unfortunately, again, the present administration is trying to, doesn't get that. It doesn't get that the reality is you don't do more of what made people angry and think you're going to stop them from being angry. Yeah. That just makes no sense whatsoever. And you're justifying the anger. And so as Christians, we're called to say, we should not be in that place, and there's a danger in not doing the righteous thing. Yeah. Because if you don't do the righteous thing, then the wrong thing becomes easier to do.
Mm. That's a good perspective. I really do appreciate that. And I think kind of as we're beginning to land the plane, I think one thing that I've admired so much about you and the work and witness you've done throughout the course of your ministry is that you've really focused on trying to figure out how to build bridges, how to reconcile where there is division, how to empower folks. I wonder, in all of this, and you've touched on this kind of a little bit, but what motivates you in spite of all of the consistent prejudice and what seems like backtracking that we have to do historically? Like, why do you keep engaging in this work?
This work is not something I do, it's something I can't help but do. That's kind of a quote from Martin Luther King, which is the only way you should do ministry. You should do it out of your passion, you should do it out of your commitment, and you should do it out of something that you feel is a call. And the call is simply to say, it's something I can't afford to just depend on other people to do. So the first thing is I have to say that. Secondly, as a Christian, I don't know that the heart of Christianity is a savior who looks at humanity and says, wow, I will, the old theology, I will become human, right? And in the human experience. And I will say unto you, greater are you that's within you, greater than that which is in the world. And so everything of theology screams, and I always say this, what is it that God knows about us that we haven't yet discovered about ourselves? The power of humanity is in that there is the image of God in us. And so I think that every person is in the answer to prayer is in every person, right? And that you and I mean, somebody prayed a long time ago, probably in the midst of being beaten in an alley somewhere because of their sexual orientation. Lord, bring up somebody who can speak in faith and hope. And Brandon became. And so because Brandon is here, those things are happening. You are the answer to prayer, right? I am an answer. I used to, when I was in university chaplaincy, I would say the reason I'm here, especially on these Ivy League campuses, because somebody looked up on a slave field and said, Lord, bless my children and my children's children. So I am here. So I have this obligation to somehow live out the meaning of my call and purpose as an answer to someone's prayer and as an answer to the situation. So every situation has an answer if we keep working together. The worst thing we can do is stop or to appeal to God there. Imagine how many times we must scream at God, God, do something. And God says, I've done something. You. That's what I did. And so rise up and do. Rise up. I think the problem, and this is our issue, which is that we can't imagine that the creator of the universe has so much confidence in ourselves, and then in confidence in us rather, and we cannot imagine because we know ourselves that out of this brokenness there is beauty and power, right? And if there's anything that is amazing to me as I work with all the diversity of people, is that after a while, when you discover the beauty and the power, you're happy that you stayed there, and we come up with something different. And so, and it gets criticized. It's some people think it's just kind of a pie in the sky, but I'm asking, how's the other stuff working? Yeah. Right. Sitting in your own silos, how's that working? Yeah. Judging folks with anger, how's that working? Being hateful, how's that working? Deciding that everyone has a bad is a bad person that don't agree with you, how's that working? It doesn't work because it isn't intended to work. It's only intended to hurt and put one or two people in power, and that person will be so insecure about power they will act meanly. Yeah. That cannot be the future that we're walking into. But I know we're landing this plane, so I'll stop.
No, I think that's a beautiful answer, and one that resonates with anybody who's trying to live into a sense of calling. I think that's really an important perspective to adopt.
I'm not sure it resonates with anybody. I'm sure there's some people yelling at the computer screen, he's a California leftist, but I believe this in South Georgia too. So
you are a California
this is not
leftist. I'm kidding.
Yeah. But it doesn't. But what I'm saying is that's also a way of belittling the reality. And it's also problematic because there are people living all over this country in small little hamlets and who believe better and hope better. There are friends in Kansas who are going to these small churches and believe this. There are people in Willacoochee, Georgia, who believe this. Yeah. And so you're wrong if you think that. It's the gospel is always bigger than you imagine, and it is something that the left does by making it somehow seemingly only people who are really enlightened understand that. Well, that's an arrogance that's not served you well either.
Yeah, totally. But before I let you go, can you tell us a little bit about?
By the way, great haircut. By the way,
thank you. Got one for the first time in a few months, so it's happy. Yeah. But can you tell us a bit about the Foundation for Peace and for Justice and Peace, and how people can find out more?
Sure. Just go to our site, which is jpf.world. We made it very easy, and you can see all the things we're involved with. We're basically people that draw upon the Martin Luther King tradition and understanding of the way in which he saw these issues and move it into various different ways. We're working on a standing course that will be involved with teaching about how do we do social change that does not lapse into simply identity groups or does not lapse into something pie in the sky. Because Martin Luther King was a person out of philosophically and theologically that allowed us to move forward and not lose our faith and our vision. So we work right now with COVID-19. We're working with African American churches around the country. We're also working with we're about to launch some work with some young people with Soul Force. The idea is, how do we look at people differently? And thirdly, we're really now thinking about how do we, quote, relaunch everything, but don't go back to the old things, right? Because it wasn't working anyway. Let's face it. The economy wasn't working anyway. Our politics wasn't working anyway. And so what we believe is that we're stepping forward. That is a quick down and dirty. Go to the site, check it out. It's and check out our YouTube page too, because you'll see what we did with pastors, a couple of conversations and things of that sort.
Awesome. Well,
it's always good to talk to the voice of his generation, which is what I call you. You don't, and you see him shaking his head. It's because I've said this from the first day I met you, which is why I engage with you. I scour the landscape and always look and see where the Spirit of God is moving and who is moving with honesty and with integrity and moving forward. And you clearly are one of those folks. So thank you for being you. I appreciate you.
I appreciate you too.